Hey guys, a couple of months ago I did a video on absolutism versus rule of law, and that video generated a fairly high amount of decent quality discussion and commentary. Some of it from the absolutists themselves. And, one of the things that they said was that my question that I asked in that video, which is better, absolutism or rule of law, was not a valid question. And I suppose that, in their view, this is because sovereignty is the ability to issue commands and be obeyed, and statements imply commands. There can be implicit, value judgments in there, and that implies an evaluator. And, the question is, who is that evaluator? And why do we care? And even though there can be many centers of, influence or linguistic, implied command, these centers in turn kind of rotate around some kind of sacred center of gravity, kind of like how planets can revolve around stars, but stars also revolve around the center of the galaxy. And so everything points back to like some kind of sacred center. All language points back to some kind of sacred center in their view, as I gather. And this is basically just an elaborate justification for monotheism. It's a new kind of monotheism. And this idea is a justification for their monotheism, and the justification relies upon linguistic theories concerning the origin of language and how language distinguishes humans from animals. And if you want to construct a justification, then something involving the origin of language is a pretty good subject to use to justify your monotheism, because it's something that's shrouded in the mists of time, going back tens of thousands of years. And so it's very difficult to check your work and, conclusively say that you're a bullshit artist and that you're full of shit, which these people are. They're creating an elaborate justification based on linguistic theories for their brand of monotheism. And we know that monotheism is false because there are many gods and many religions worshipped by many people, practiced by many people in many different ways around the world, and there always have been and there always will be, right? Because even if, one religion hypothetically were to succeed in gaining the upper hand and displacing all others, then you would just have schisms and conflicts within that religion between different people who, though they're worshiping, let's say the same God by the same name, have very different conceptions of that God and maybe worship him in very different ways, and so nevertheless are practicing different religions. And so this idea of monotheism, that everything points back to a single sacred center, is empirically false. We don't see that happening with people or with anything. There are centralizing tendencies. Religions grow just like empires grow, and then they fall apart, right? Those are both natural processes. And we don't see one sacred center. We see a lot of different people sacralizing and tabooing different things. And that's not necessarily an invalid thing to do, right? When you sacralize something or taboo something, you're basically placing it beyond the bounds of discourse or debate or discussion or, critical thought. You're just saying this question is settled and we're not going to revisit it. It's sacred or taboo, we don't want to debate pedophilia and age of consent with libertarians because that's pointless, It's just something that you either get it or you don't. And if you don't get it, we're not particularly interested in having a society with you or cooperating with you in any way, and there's not really anything left to do but, fight, because that's something that's taboo. We've decided that, that question is settled, we're moving on. And, sacred is the same thing in the other direction. And there's just not much, if there's not much to be gained by rehashing something or going over it again, then, sacralizing or tabooing can be perfectly useful heuristics and adaptive heuristics. And I understand that they have a lot more moral and emotional significance than that to most people. But fundamentally, that seems to be what's going on. And you know, people sacralize and taboo different things in different ways, and those constitute their particular evolutionary strategies, their survival strategies, their reproductive strategies, and those can differ from one group of people to another, or even from one individual to another. So we don't see all of this pointing back to a single sacred center. We see different bundles of sacreds and taboos constituting different survival and reproductive strategies being employed by different people in different ways. And, you know, whatever centralizing tendencies there may be, you know, monotheistic or, you know, political or otherwise, you know, they're counterbalanced by, you know, schismatic tendencies or decentralizing tendencies, or, you know, the collapse of empires, and so on and so forth. Speciation, division, right? That happens too. So, you know, it doesn't appear to be empirically tenable, this worldview that these absolutists are, you know, basing on these elaborate linguistic theories. And what it amounts to in the end is, you know, they're trying to deny me, just like the postmodernists are trying to deny me a language to articulate and defend my own interests. Because the question of, is absolutism or rule of law, which is better, you know, they want to define that as a meaningless question because they want absolutism to prevail. But it's not a meaningless question to me. Which is better for me? That's a perfectly valid question for my interests. That's a valid question, and it's valid for someone like me to ask, and it's valid for you to ask in terms of yourself and your own interests. And they're trying to shut down these kind of questions and discussions with these totalitarian linguistic theories. Now, another criticism they offered was that rule of law is not existentially possible because, you know, the law doesn't literally sit in some literal throne and literally rule. And, you know, okay, fine. But by the same token, I could say that absolutism is not existentially possible, because even if you have some hierarchy with nominally absolute authority on top, you know, that authority cannot be in all places and do all things. And so that authority has to delegate some decision-making power to underlings below them in a hierarchy, who have to exercise some discretion in the discharge of the duties and the powers that they're delegated. And so they're going to leave their own kind of mark and their own kind of imprint in the exercise of those powers. And so in a practical sense, you know, decision-making is always distributed to some extent, right? It's never absolutely concentrated in a single authority. So, you know, absolutism is not existentially possible. And, you know, when I say rule of law, you know, I don't mean that the law is literally ruling. I just mean that, you know, there are some restraints placed on people higher up in the hierarchy by people below them. And that's always a practical fact. You know, even a nominally absolute authority, if they exercise that authority in ways that are too contradictory to the interests of the people below them, you know, they're going to face mutiny or revolt or a coup or whatever. So, you know, that's really all I mean by rule of law, and just codifying that rather than, so it's acknowledged explicitly rather than just being a tacit fact. Now, they said I was a libertarian who's too cowardly to own my own totalizing system. I don't have any totalizing system, okay? I am an authoritarian. I think it's useful to have hierarchies so that you have decision-making authorities, right? People who can make the final decision in cases that are not objectively decidable, or where people will not intersubjectively agree on a single decision. Sometimes it can be useful to have authorities to decide things like that, to be the final decision-making authority in those kind of cases. And but I'm not a totalitarian, you know, because those people are not able to make all decisions at all levels of the hierarchy. And so a lot of decision-making authority, as a practical matter, just needs to be distributed. down and out in various ways. And so I'm not a totalitarian, I am an authoritarian. I'm fine with having a robust authority to make the necessary decisions, but it's not necessary for that authority to make all decisions, okay? There's plenty of room for distributed decision making, and that frequently works better. So, not a libertarian, but I'm not a totalitarian by the same token. And finally, there was a category of arguments that were made. These are called formalism, and in the formalist view of things, chaos is bad by definition and order is good, because all good things ultimately depend on order, and chaos produces primarily bad things. And there's a lot of truth to this. And another category of arguments that would fall under this formalism heading are that if authorities are doing bad things or things that we think are bad, then probably the main reason for that is because their authority is under threat and they're trying to protect their authority from threats. And if their authority was more secure, they would have more positive long-term incentives. It's like we say, monarchs have better positive long-term incentives than elected leaders, because they've got an eye towards the future. They want to maintain the value of their realm and subjects with an eye towards passing it on to their successors, their hereditary successors. And so they're going to have better incentives. And owners are going to have better incentives than renters. And so for the same reason, a secure authority is going to have better incentives and have better actions and decisions on average than somebody whose authority is under threat, is insecure, and who feels the need to do draconian measures to protect themselves and their authority from those threats. And there's a lot of truth to both of these arguments. I think where they fall apart in this case is because there are just too many irreconcilable conflicts of interest at this point between what we call elites and us normal people at the bottom. And they keep squeezing us harder and harder. And in part, that's because there are simply too many elites. Like, in addition to the descendants of the nobles and aristocrats we disinherited in the Enlightenment, the liberal Enlightenment, those people didn't go away. Many of their descendants are still around, have a lot of wealth and influence, but we've also added commercial elites, financial elites, intellectual elites, and entertainers to the ranks of what we generally consider to be elites. And there's simply too many of these people to continue supporting in the manner to which they've become accustomed, frankly. And that's part of why they squeeze us so hard, because they're trying to maintain that lifestyle and that status and that wealth that they are accustomed to. They're not going to give it up without a fight. But, if we don't push back against, our own dispossession and displacement and disinheritance by, let's say, mass migration in this game of high and low against the middle that they're playing against us, if we don't push back against that, we're going to suffer and worse, cease to exist, right? But if we do push back successfully, they're going to suffer, at the very least, a tremendous diminution in wealth and status and esteem and prestige, things that they're not going to give up without a fight. So this difference, these conflicts are irreconcilable fundamentally. We can't both get what we want, and so somebody has to not get what they want, and it's perfectly rational for me to prefer that I get what I want and somebody else doesn't get what they want. Namely, in this case, these so-called elites, many of whom are not elite in any meaningful way, right? A lot of them are pretty useless, to be honest. So, screw them. Yeah, that's most of what I have to say about that. And, don't forget to check out my Patreon, where I post exclusive content for my patrons, where there are other ways to contribute if you can. Like, share, subscribe. or check out my merchandise links below.